Well, look, thanks a lot for having me along. It's great to be here in person, and of course, thanks to everyone else that has taken time out their day to come along and hear us speak. Hopefully, between Ricardo and myself, we can give you one or two things that you might take away to your day jobs or daily lives. Failing that, there's some free beer, free pizza, which is always good. In this day and age, free central heating. So, a couple hours of well-saved time, quite frankly. So as Colin said, I'm Johnny. I work at NatWest. Software engineer by trade. Went to University of Strathclyde 15 years ago. We're a gold partner of Finos, one of the co-sponsors of this meetup, and long-term partner and user of ScotLogic. I think we've been using their services since 2014, so we need to have some sort of 10-year anniversary bash at some point in the near future. And at NatWest, I lead a lot of our API technology efforts. Not all of them, because it's such a sort of persuasive paradigm in technology these days, but things like our API platform, open banking, etc. Purpose of my talk, I'm going to have a bit of a meander around how we've applied a kind of open source culture and mindset to building APIs. And hopefully if you apply some of these kind of tips, techniques, thoughts to your own development, you might realise some of the value that we've managed to realise at NatWest. So, bit about myself, father of three, Tom, Cora and Joel, 6, 4 and 3. I'm open to speaking events at bedtime any day of the week. Please, bring them on. Husband of one, she's on the right. She clearly has a thing for big noses, which in reflection plays quite a big part in probably why we're together and married. Cat dad to one, Frank, built him on mould. I'm told we're getting a dog sometime in December. And I am both proud and privileged to sit on the board of the Glasgow Children's Hospital charity. For those that don't know, they're a charity that work to raise funds to fund life-saving and life-changing moments for children at the Glasgow Children's Hospital. Slight bit of bias in that statement, it's not an anti-Edinburgh thing. The Glasgow Children's Hospital actually sees kids from all over Scotland, and actually kids come from all around the world to get their world-class care and expertise. So, if you want to chat to me about any of that stuff, please feel free to grab me at the end. I'm more than happy to. So I thought I would start with a bit of an analogy. We'll go on a bit of a journey really. And that analogy is really how people view APIs. And my view is that most people, teams and organisations view APIs a wee bit like the plumbing underneath their sink. So for those that have looked under their sinks, you'll see random bends. You have absolutely no idea what they do. That feels like something they should have taught you at some sort of class in secondary school, quite frankly. A bit like paying bills and tax and things like that, but hey ho. There's random valves that go to your dishwasher, your washing machine. There's a mix of copper and plastic that, quite frankly, only the plumbing gods understand. But most likely that's all they had in the back of their van at the time. But the point is, this stuff's hidden. It's narrow in focus. It's built independently for seemingly every single sink that exists. I've never seen a sink with the same plumbing underneath it, right? And I think that's actually a bit analogous to software development in general, if I'm quite honest. I mean, if you look at the open source world, to Colin's point, 5 years ago, people built stuff in isolation, hidden, away from view. I'm here to take a bit of a contrarian view to that, and I'd hopefully like for everyone to leave this talk thinking the same way that I do, or at least partially, perhaps the same way that I do, that APIs actually, if you apply the concepts of building in the open, mass collaboration, etc., you can extract real value for them, value that you didn't really know exists. Bit of a history lesson to start. This isn't like, there was no kind of magic moment for us at NatWest that allowed us to really truly understand the value of APIs. But there was something that happened a few years back that really started us down this path and to where we are today. Quick show of hands would be great for anyone in the room that's heard of open banking. 50-50, great. I can give a bit of a history lesson, that's always good. I'll try and explain why we've got so many words in the financial services space that begin with the word open, and how they kind of are and aren't a wee bit like open source and not at the same time. So pre-2016, 2017, we had, what we sometimes refer to as bespoke value chains. So I won't ask people to show hands here, but if I think about the number of data grids that I built as a JavaScript developer, or the number of deployment systems that I built as a software engineer, or the number of layout capabilities I built as a software engineer, some with Scott Logic, that were completely proprietary to the company that I was working at, it would be frightening, right? Most of that work these days is freely available and open. The kind of aha moment for banking was this thing called open banking. Open banking came about roughly 2017, but basically it was a mandate to the banks that said, you guys, girls, people, you all need to expose the guts of your services and propositions to third parties in order for those third parties to innovate on behalf of your joint customer base. So the idea was that they would open themselves up, they would allow third parties to then use that capability, and those third parties could really add value to customers' lives. Now, again, analogous to open source, the idea is people open themselves up, they create contributions, people use those contributions and add value for customers. There's some subtle differences, quite frankly. You can openly view these APIs, you can interact with sandboxes. Actually, to use them in production, you need to be qualified because we're dealing with people's money, and that's deemed to be a sensitive operation that you need to kind of show that you're an adult for. There's a few things that came about after that. This thing called PSD2, very boring, but basically mandated across Europe that everyone will follow. And going into the future, you've got these concepts like open finance that you might hear, and something that was written into legislation called smart data. Smart data being, as a human being, you're the one that owns the data that you give to companies. And what that's going to do is force companies across industries to open themselves up and give the option for other companies and innovators to produce great capabilities. Some examples that might jump to mind is the insurance industry. Wouldn't it be great if, a third party could really get access to what you pay in insurance and what that covers you for? Wouldn't it be great if you could get real access to your energy data from your home? Things like that. Wouldn't it be great if you could get real access to pensions data without having 6 weeks worth of mole burrowing to find where you left money? And all these things lead to a kind of open culture and world where value can be created. So where do open source and APIs cross over? Now I've put on screen a slightly overweight, balding, older gentleman. I am not older, so it's not me. But the point here is that, in my opinion, there's been a period of time where people have behaved a wee bit like the Monopoly man. And by that I mean, the thing that they're working on is the greatest thing since sliced bread. There's absolutely no possibility that someone else could be doing something better or someone else could benefit from that. And that's the same concept across open source, whether it's a data grid, a set of components, a deployment framework, etc., as it is with APIs. If you can provide capabilities that people can use, people can create value very quickly. We use the term coopetition over competition. That is that, it's better, I'm not even going to try and say that word, but it's better cooperating with other parties on the things that are shared value, the things that don't really add value to your business, and really focusing on the things that do add value to your business, so the things that differentiate you from someone else trying to do something. They both shield people from the hard work underneath. It's really hard to build complex components. React, there's a whole team at Facebook that build this stuff. We wouldn't dream of trying to reinvent that in Scott Logic or NatWest or any other software company you're at. The same is true with all the stuff that happens underneath the covers of an API. There's actually some really complex stuff that goes on that you just want to make freely available to people, for people to consume. They're both fundamentally ecosystem plays. Creating an ecosystem where people can coexist. And the basic concept of an ecosystem in nature is, a thriving ecosystem, as it grows, everyone in the ecosystem grows as well. So we apply the same thinking to how we think about getting APIs into production. The bigger that ecosystem, the more we can give to developers to use and build propositions. Generally speaking, the more successful they'll be. Maybe pointing out the obvious a wee bit. Again, I quite like this diagram just to kind of bring to life how I visualise kind of various people in the open source and API world. So in the open source world, you've got contributions, people that have decided to take projects and make them available. You've got contributors that may be the same people that have contributed that thing originally, or actually they might be people outside of that contribution. You've got observers, the lurkers, the people that are quite happy to come along to a meet-up and ask a difficult question. None of those. Or raise a slightly obnoxious issue on your GitHub repo. And you've, of course, got consumers. Same's true for APIs, really. You've got providers, people that build them. Okay, sometimes you can contribute to those things, sometimes you can't. You've got contributors, which we'll look at in a wee bit of detail in the next few slides. You still have observers, the people that turn up and want you to change something, and absolutely you've got consumers. Great example of that from an observer's perspective. At NatWest, we get about 100 tickets a month raised on our APIs from third parties, so people that want feature requests, changes, enhancements. Again, if we as a bank could find a way to treat that with an open source mindset, almost open issues, maybe we could find a better way of collaborating with the community, but that's a bit of a kind of out there idea to some extent. So very quickly bringing that to life for open banking and beyond. Providers, banks, people that hold data, consumers, fintechs, people that want to take that data and innovate with it. And then we've got the observers, which in our case tend to be kind of regulators and people that want to hold this to a standard, perhaps in the open source world. Best kind of compared to the community. They hold contributions and projects to a standard. Okay, so I thought one of the interesting things just to share with everyone was some of the principles that we actually distribute in NatWest in terms of how we'd like people to think about APIs. And actually when you read them, I don't actually think they're that different to how people should think about open source. So the first is product over project. And the best analogy I've got for this is actually when I went to my son's summer school class and witnessed what it was all these children were trying to do. And what they were trying to do was they were trying to build the tallest tower with paper and straws, which was absolute carnage, quite frankly. As an engineer, you're like, oh God, this is killing me here. So you had the kids that were like finely balancing newspapers on top of one another because they had to get from A to B being higher than everyone else. That's project. You want to go from A to B, nothing else matters. Then you had the kids that were building foundations with bits of paper and straws and, creating all sorts of elaborate things that meant that they were on solid footing. So we like to get people to think about, when you're delivering capabilities, think about them as products, not just about the next feature that you put into production. What APIs could you deliver as part of that product? The same, I think, is analogous to open source in that, maybe you're building a project with something that might be useful to the community. How do you take that and build it as a first-class citizen and contribute it back? Think externally, an important one if you ever want to put anything out into the wild. If you don't think like this, you will get savaged. Would I be willing to show this thing to someone that worked at a different company? What would their feedback be? Would they be net positive, or would they, get nitpicky about documentation? So presenting ourselves to the world in a way that makes sense and is attractive, I think, is a major play in API culture coming from open source. Expect unseen reuse. This is one of the things at NatWest we are almost continually surprised by. Yang and Stacey in the audience, feel free to go and tap them up later on. But I can confidently say every time we build an API, when it's in production, randomly 3, 5, 10 teams pop out of nowhere and they go, that's super useful, man. Like, we've been looking for this forever. Thanks a lot. So, get yourself in that mindset. Same with open source contributions. You should expect unseen reuse. Most of your users are probably anonymous in the first place. Try and keep to one-ish. you know, like I know that's hard for software engineers, but if someone's developed an API, I don't know, an accounts API, we try and make sure that if someone else has a capability they want to add to that, rather than creating accounts API 2, they actually collaborate with the provider of that API. Again, I've seen this time and again in the open source world where data grid A doesn't have a feature, so the obvious answer isn't to try and collaborate and contribute back to that, but go and build your own, of course. And be open, you know, I think that's a really difficult thing to convey to people. But as you're building stuff, you know, could it be something that could be contributed for the value of others? And most people have that plumbing mindset, as I say. They think about A to B, how they can get their thing in production quickly, but actually, you know, maybe step back and think, is this something that could be contributed as an individual contribution and would add value to others? And hopefully that kind of leads to this, which I think is very similar to the open source space, and anyone that's ever been involved in delivering software projects will hopefully recognise this. But in the past, what's happened at NatWest is, not just NatWest, by the way, every organisation I've been at, and probably every organisation most people have been at, is there's kind of an inordinate amount of time spent convincing people that you want to do something. There's then an inordinate amount of time doing all the stuff that doesn't really matter about that idea. So, you know, how do you get a bank balance, for example? Well, that's 6 months of work, and, you know, you've got to connect 5 different systems together to get it. Then the amount of time you get to spend on proving that idea is pretty small in reality. And shipping is equally difficult because you've then got to go and get all these people that you've convinced, all this plumbing that you've created into production. That's really hard. Actually, with both open source, with APIs, you hopefully get to spend much more time in that idea. You know, maybe you'll be successful, you know, you get less kind of idea fatigue, so people get less tired of the thing you're trying to build, and therefore you can get further along the value kind of spectrum. Or maybe you just fail faster. You don't spend 6 months getting to the point where you can start on the thing, but you can fail faster. So again, applying that kind of culture to how you build APIs and how you think about creating value for the organisation you work in, hopefully leads to the bottom diagram as opposed to the top diagram. I got a feeling like it's going to be like an Alien movie and it's just going to get darker and darker this way.
Yeah, we're saving electricity.
If the lights go out and I'm in Colin's arms, I apologise. Another thing to think about is different ends of kind of your open source spectrum, and again it's the same with APIs. So at NatWest we tend to have 2 ends of the spectrum. One is what we call business APIs, the other is what we call system APIs. Very contentious point, generally speaking, because everyone has a definition for what these things should be called. Business API, highly curated, thing that we would put out into the public domain, we should be proud of, we should treat as, you know, the next button in our mobile app. Analogous to, you know, some of the most famous open source projects out there that really take care in what they do, how they present themselves, how they interact with the community. I tend to think of these things, or tend to describe these things to people as the manicured, curated garden. So you spend an awful lot of time, you know, creating basically the Chelsea Flower Show to get these things live. The standard is high. And then on the other end of the spectrum, system APIs. So people just want to contribute stuff somewhere, right? They want to land what they think has some sort of value somewhere. We tend to call them system APIs. It's probably a wee bit of a misnomer. There's a bit of complexity there, but again, applying this kind of culture of there's some stuff that, you know, you should take pride in and is really important, but you shouldn't forget that there's a whole bunch of really useful stuff that your organisation's probably doing that you should find ways to bring to life as well. A couple more slides and we'll take some questions. So some things to explore, you know, what have we done at NatWest to try and, you know, make this possible, make it a reality. Internal tooling, we're currently looking at various things. We have, you know, fairly standard tools like GitLab, if you've come across that. We're currently looking at tools like Postman Enterprise to try and increase collaboration for those system APIs that I spoke about. So how do you get stuff in a single place where you can easily see what people are doing, collaborate on those open API specs, and iterate them towards something of value. I'm hoping that's going to be a bit of a game changer for us. You need to spend a wee bit of time on your developer experience. This stuff doesn't really happen by accident. It's again a bit like the open source space. I don't really believe, someone just happens to have worked on something and then it suddenly becomes open sourced. Actually, they tend to work with a mindset of this thing is going to be public in the near future. So we're looking at things like Backstage.io to do that. Quite an interesting project for people to go and look at. But it's effectively Spotify's developer platform, open sourced, and allows developers to come to a central kind of town hall to figure out how to do stuff and navigate the organization. We've got some API first architecture type concepts that we're trying to embed in the bank. Again, this is, I think, fairly simple, but trying to give people a place where they can come and debate what good looks like. How do we teach people things they've never done before? So by providing API design kind of expertise, open API expertise, hopefully they can come and at least get pointed in the right direction. And finally, sometimes you just need to put a few bets on the roulette table. You have to kind of pick some stuff that you want to go after and go for it. I just wanted to squeeze a picture of Doom in. I had this in another meetup slide. This is, again, hopefully the nirvana that organizations can achieve if they do treat delivering APIs into their organization and making them freely available a wee bit like they would if they were open sourcing. On the right, you've got what I call dependency hell, which is pretty much what every single software development project can eventually look like. APIs unlock the ability to get up and running with stuff instantly, to deploy to prod without having to worry about what other people are doing, etc. It allows you to remove yourself from this thing on the right. I've always described it inside the bank as kind of APIs instead of Gantt charts, i.e. how do we get to the point where rather than having to project manage software to production, you can mostly reuse another team's APIs without ever having to speak to them. There's a really good blog post by a guy called Brian Armstrong. Kind of works in a space that I'm not too au fait with, but he's the leader of Coinbase, a big crypto company. He wrote a blog post on how to scale companies. He did successfully scale his company to quite a large number of people. And as the CEO of that company, interestingly, one of the, I think, 5 points for scaling the company was APIs instead of meetings. You should be able to scale by not having to speak to human beings, because the more people you speak to, rightly or wrongly, tends to slow you down. We do some of the same things as the open source space does to try and foster the community, figure out what people want. So meetups and forums. We held a meetup in 250 Bishopsgate in London recently. We had maybe about 20 software companies come in and speak to us about how they were using what we were providing, what they wanted to see change, what they wanted to see added. Really useful. Again, very similar to the open source space. Blog content, widen your funnel, get people excited about what you're doing, talk about what they can do with it and what value can be found. We're trying to open source some stuff. So that's SDKs to use these things more easily, Postman collections to get up and running quicker, or sample applications to, effectively download and get going without having to write any of your own code. And there's a bit of an inner source type culture out there as well, which is kind of the Postman stuff that I've spoken about, i.e. create a place inside your company to talk about this stuff and figure out how to add value. Another thing I wanted to end with was just a comparison of, why do I think if you think in this way, you could really unlock value for your company? Well, 2018, we had what I would describe as 0 APIs, 0 customers using them, 0 API hits, etc. Last month, we had 270 unique companies hitting NatWest to get information about our joint customer base. Those are people that are creating value for our customers without us having to do anything, which is insane, right? That's absolutely unbelievable. 900 million API calls a month for people to get data, move money, change addresses, do all sorts of stuff. We've had roughly about 4 million customers use propositions that use the APIs we provide. We've transacted close to about £5.5 billion worth of people's money through APIs that we provide at NatWest now. And this is all through us providing APIs that other people use to provide value for customers, just like people that provide components, frameworks, etc. in the open source space to innovate for their customers. It's all free value in my head. So this kind of size of the prize is really there to go after, appreciating that NatWest is maybe a slightly bigger company than some, but I think this is really applicable at almost any scale. That was my WizStop tour. Happy to take some questions if we're...
I'll take a host's privilege and kick off with a question. I was just wondering, considering that you're building APIs, you're building something that's consumed externally, do you think that makes it easier for you to argue the value of contributing to and consuming open source than, say, someone who might be working on something purely internal, like a data lake or something like that? Because I know banks arguing the case for contributing to open source is a challenge. I was wondering if you have any kind of competitive advantage there.
A wee bit. I think the whole kind of open banking space has got people kind of excited and reinvigorated about open source more generally. It's certainly something that's very easy to point at in terms of, you know, value that people can realise without you having to know what value they're trying to realise, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Even off the back of this stuff, you know, I pointed at it in the slides, you know, we are trying to push things like open source SDKs for people to use our APIs. We're trying to create sample apps for potential customers to download and get going with. That we want to open source all that stuff.
Well, yeah, you mentioned Backstage. You're effectively doing your own Backstage for your APIs. Yeah, you're creating the portals.
That in itself actually is a really good vehicle inside the bank to have that conversation.
Yeah.
So to some extent, I think yes, you know, people that work, you know, really inside in that kind of under the sink sort of space that I spoke about earlier on, it is a harder conversation for them to have, but you know, one we're starting to get into as a bank and try and explore.
Cool. Any other questions? It does feel weird wandering around with the mic. Apparently it doesn't do much, but
yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Is that working?
Yeah.
It's working, yeah.
We can hear you.
Apparently, excellent.
Sound waves.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. Quick question for me, or from me, I should say. Are open APIs available for open source developers, or are they more aimed at the business community?
Good question, yeah. So there's a scale. There's some open APIs that provide information. Those open APIs, in my opinion, aren't particularly valuable, if I'm being entirely honest. You know, they provide things like locations of branches and ATMs and products, etc. There's then a spectrum that you kind of go through, which is we have APIs that allow you to get people's accounts, transactions, direct debits, make payments on their behalf. You could get access to them in a sandbox. So you could sign up on our developer portal today. So if you visited bankofapis.com, you could get sandbox access and use things in non-production that are very like the production APIs. Challenge with giving people access to production APIs is that, you know, you are dealing with people's money, their livelihoods, etc. Therefore, you do need to be licensed by the FCA, or you need to sign a contract with the bank that we're willing to effectively give you access to those things on our own license. So, short answer is no, they're not quite available to Joe Blogs. You know, if you were working at the bank, they're freely available to you. So if you were building a random proposition and you had to get someone's bank balance, gone are the days where you've got to jump through like 10 fiery hoops and, you know, to get that, you can instantly use it. But the people that consume our APIs today tend to be regulated companies. We're starting to move into spaces where we're giving access to customers, but those customers, at least in the initial stages, are going to be bigger corporates. So people that do a lot of business with us would benefit from direct access to their accounts, or, you know, building kind of banking as a service type capabilities.
Another question at the back there?
Sorry.
How do I, as a customer of the bank, opt out of my personal data being shared with anybody by any API ever?
You have to opt in to begin with, is the short answer.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
We've actually got a blog post on the authentication process within open banking, if you're interested. So yeah, it is an opt-in process. The UX, the user experience, is pretty poor in a lot of cases.
Not NatWest.
Not NatWest, of course. Sorry, should have put in that caveat. Any other questions? Yeah.
Cat.
Hello. I was just wondering, I found in my current workplace that engineers can be particularly opinionated about standards and things of that nature. Have you struggled with that in NatWest, about how you standardize across your APIs, and how, and if you haven't, I'd love to know how, because I've definitely struggled. But do you have plans? I heard about town halls and things, but is there things that you're planning on doing in order to create that kind of community that feels like it's feeding into the thing, but you're still kind of going in the same direction?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I guess we come at this from two angles. So the first is, we spoke about this concept of having highly curated business APIs. So again, trying to keep the kind of analogy to the open source world, this is stuff that we as a bank choose to care about. We're quite opinionated on. We hold standards that are quite hard to get around, if that makes sense. So when you go onto the bank of APIs, the goal is it should feel like the retail banking mobile app. So even though the retail banking mobile app, trade secret here, is built by quite a few teams across the bank, lending screens, current account screens, saving screens, etc. They're all using capabilities from across the bank. They look and feel like the same thing, right? You feel like you're banking with one bank. Same with any big company, Facebook, WhatsApp, whatever it is. So we hold them to high standards, and we do have debates about, do I really need to be held to this standard? Can I not just use this name instead of this name? And we've got people that face into those problems. So standard bearers, people that try and hold that across the organisation. The one thing we're looking at the minute is on that system API side of the spectrum, which is where things like Postman Enterprise might come in, for example, or another tool, perhaps, and where we're trying to allow people to contribute into a place where we can at least see what people are doing, and then move them from that place to a place that we're comfortable with. Again, I'm not sure I described it on the slide, but on that system API side, the way I kind of describe it is imagine you had a garden and you just threw some seeds out the back and you just kind of let it grow like a slightly wild. Mostly weeds. The odd beautiful flower. The beautiful flowers are probably quite easy to get up to that end of the spectrum. There'll certainly be some kind of, weedy type things that we'd like to take from where they are to where we'd like them to be. I don't have a silver bullet answer for that. Software engineers are inherently, they have opinions.
That was very polite. I could see your brain racing with, no, not that. Opinionated.
Been recorded. Opinionated.
We can hear your real opinions.
It's a universal challenge. If anyone in the room has some sort of magic potion or anything to solve that, I'm all ears.
Cool. Well, I think one more round of applause for Johnny there. That was really good.